I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining the Advisory Council's conversation with law enforcement. Over several meetings, the Council discussed the documented increase in domestic violence during the pandemic and learned of the frighteningly high numbers that have continued even as life has returned to what we're referring to now as the new normal. Then several widely reported cases caused us to ask some hard questions about protective resources, one of the most vital being law enforcement. That's how we got to this evening. We want to know more to understand the current relationships and how we as Advisory Council members might support efforts to make them even better. I'm extremely pleased that Advisory Council member Ridgewood Chief of Police Jacquie Luthcke has agreed to facilitate the discussion. Jackie, as I know her, was promoted to Ridgewood's chief in 2016, having started her career as a patrol officer in 1996. She has had a distinguished career as the first female to hold that position on the Ridgewood force and was recently recognized by the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office for her critical role in law enforcement during Women's History Month. She also has impressive credentials, including a BA in sociology and criminology, finishing the West Point Command and Leadership Program at the top of her class. I would expect nothing less. Career building assignments in community policing and overseeing the department's national credentialing process. Before I turn the program over to Jackie, just one instruction for those of you in the audience. If you have a question for the panelists, we're using the Q&A function so that the question may be asked in confidence without identifying who is asking. Q&A works just like chat. Just type in your question, and then at the end of the discussion, I'll share them with Jackie and the panelists as we have time. Okay, I'm now turning the program over into Jackie's very capable hands. Jackie?
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Advisory Council members, members of the Center for Hope and Safety Board of Directors, Julie, Myra, and staff for working to make tonight happen. Your questions and concerns have been shared with me and with our panelists. We hope that over the next hour, we can begin to explore the complex relationship between police and survivors of domestic violence in a way that leads us to new opportunities in order to strengthen our ties. Let me begin by introducing our panelists for tonight's conversation. First is Assistant Prosecutor Elizabeth Rebein. Liz serves as the Chief of the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office Community Engagement Division and as its Public Information Officer. She also provides in-service training and continuing legal education classes on subjects as diverse as ethics, media and public relations, search and seizure, HIPAA, screening laws, and appellate practice. Liz represents the prosecutor on the Bergen County Local Advisory Committee on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, the Bergen County Human Relations Commission, the Crisis Intervention Team Steering Committee, and is co-chair of the Bergen County Mental Health Working Group. Tim Torrell was a detective captain with the City of Englewood Police Department. For more than a decade during his 40-year career, he was the lead domestic violence instructor at the Bergen County Police Academy in Mahwah. He also served as his department's domestic violence liaison to the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, was the officer in charge of all DV investigations for the Englewood Police Department, was recognized as a DV expert in both municipal and superior court, and served on many domestic violence awareness and prevention initiatives and projects, including Bergen County's own Judicial Working Group. Tim is now the Community Service Director for the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. And Taylor Craney is the Center for Hope and Safety's staff attorney. She joined CHS in 2021 and is a passionate advocate for domestic violence survivors. Taylor represents survivors in matters including final restraining orders, custody, divorce, child support, safe visitation, spousal support, and immigration. Prior to joining the staff, Taylor worked with survivors for over a decade, starting as a certified sexual assault crisis counselor while an undergraduate student. Then in law school, Taylor worked with Rutgers Law Associates Day One, and Sanctuary for Families, serving as the university's student coordinator for Sanctuary for Families Courtroom Advocates Project. In 2020, she was the recipient of the Carol Russ Memorial Prize for Promotion of Women's Rights in the Law. As it is very evident from these introductions, this is quite a formidable group indeed. Thank you, Liz, Tim, and Taylor, for lending your expertise to this evening's conversation. And if we're all ready, let's get started. So the first question I have for the panel is, law enforcement can be a life-saving resource for survivors during a domestic violence emergency. Do police have the power to keep survivors safe? Who wants to take a crack at that one first?
I can take a crack at that one unless anyone else wants to. Just a little bit of background. At CHS, our legal department works mainly in the civil realm. We don't work so much. We work kind of in a quasi-criminal realm, but we mainly work in civil and family court. I would say that absolutely police have the power to keep survivors safe. We do a lot of restraining order cases, and just a little legal background. Again, it's a little more complicated than what I'm about to say, but once a temporary restraining order has been filed, there's kind of two routes that someone can take in order to resolve the case. The first is to go through with a hearing through the court to get a final restraining order. The second is to settle it with what we call a civil restraint consent order. There's pros and cons to both, but one of the big pros of final restraining orders that our clients very much take into consideration is that violating it is a crime and that they can call the police, and the police have to arrest the individual who violated it. That's not true with the civil restraint consent order. And for a lot of our clients, that is a very, very important aspect that makes them, in a lot of cases, that is the deciding factor if they go forward for the restraining order or not, is that extra protection that they know that they can pick up the phone, call the police, and that it will be enforced that way. So I do think that the police absolutely have the power to keep survivors safe with that enforcement, with that deterrence, and with that intervention.
I think I would supplement the answer and say that police have some tools to help keep survivors safe, but certainly police are not all powerful, and those tools are not always going to work. So it's really important for individuals to know what safety measures exist, what options are available within the criminal justice system, within the court system, and to be made aware of what options are available to them and those tools, and to be able to use them. But many of these situations are nuanced and complicated and quickly evolving. So while officers certainly do have tools available to them, they can't fix everything and can't prevent everything from happening. And so I would just add the caveat to Taylor's answer that those are tools that are available.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in too and kind of echo what Liz and Taylor said and reemphasize that, yeah, I definitely think the answer to that question is yes, with that caveat. One of the biggest tools that, as you all know, that police got when the domestic violence laws changed was the ability to make arrest without witnessing the crime, especially on disorderly persons offenses. That was huge. That was a game changer. But again, yes, we can keep victims safe, but to the extent of the rest of the system doing its job in conjunction with the police system.
I think that did just have a very full picture of kind of the challenges that police may have with some of those protections that are out there. And I think that was a good way to start this conversation. The Center for Hope and Safety staff sometimes coordinate with police to ensure a victim's safety or to assist them in retrieving their belongings when they are being threatened by their abuser. Staff has shared that sometimes the responsiveness from police can be a little bit of a mixed bag. For example, CHS staff report that there are still times when both parties are arrested, or police support is given to the party who called first. Are police prepared and trained to be able to handle the dynamics of a domestic abuse situation? Do they recognize as serious all forms of abuse and escalation, not just the more obvious when we're seeing physical signs?
I'd love for Captain Torrell to answer this question and speak from the perspective of an officer who, for 40 years saw the evolution in training and response and can really speak to what that looks like today.
Yeah, wow, that's, if I had the time, that'd be about an hour answer, but we don't have that long of a time because that is really a complex question and there's so many different facets to it. I can tell you that one of the main segments of my instruction up at the police academy, I teach twice a year to the recruits. So the new cops coming on, I teach the nuts and bolts, the practical parts of being a cop and going to a domestic violence scene and being able to use the tools that we get. And one of the main blocks of instruction that I would give, not only to the recruits, but also to the in-service cops that had been around and were taking refresher courses, is the subject of mutual arrest. And mutual arrest are difficult situations, but they shouldn't happen that frequently. They should be far and few, in my opinion. I remember when the show Cops first came out, it was based out of, they were following around Miami cops. And every time the domestic violence laws had just changed, not only in New Jersey, but nationwide, and had given that power to cops to make arrests, like I described earlier. And I saw so many times early in that evolution of the DV world where cops would go to a scene, they'd see both parties bloody and immediately say, well, I see visible signs, both of you are going to jail. And that's not what the laws were written. That's not the purpose the laws were written. We later on, as the new law was thrown upon cops, there was an evolution, and I think that is a good word, on how to deal with those situations. And the fact that it's a cop's job, in fact, it's written right in 2C, our laws, we have to pick out the primary aggressor. We have to investigate before we put the cuffs on somebody and take away their liberty. So the whole concept of mutual arrest should be few and far between. Then that's just one aspect of that question. But the cops are prepared to handle domestic violence situations. They get a ton of training, both mandatory and not mandatory, in-house. It's just they're fighting a battle right now, and we can talk about this later on. And one of those battles was, for its good aspects and its bad aspects, was when bail reform hit us in January of 2017. That changed the dynamics in a lot of ways for how cops handled situations and how they reacted to basically arresting somebody for a relatively serious offense or just a domestic violence offense. And then before they're done with the paperwork, the suspect is walking out the door. That was a huge issue with police officers, and it's been exacerbated over the years for a number of factors. I don't want to hog this, but that's my part of my answer.
Anyone else?
I think one of the reasons that that I'm on this panel discussion tonight rather than the assistant prosecutors who handle our domestic violence cases is because this conversation is really about changing policy and about training and the relationship that exists between law enforcement and providers and community groups. And so the perspective that I would share is that the training, law enforcement training, is very different today than it was just 10 years ago, and certainly dramatically different than 15 or 20 years ago. And that is because so much of what we do now is multidisciplinary. There has been a recognition that people are complicated, situations are complicated, and officers who are responding to these calls need to be equipped with more information about what we know about human behavior and to prepare them to be able to respond quickly. And so whether that is a domestic violence situation, or that is someone who is in a mental health crisis, or someone who is in the middle of an overdose, or someone who is having a medical emergency, we expect police officers to know what to do and how to navigate that situation immediately after they have made an assessment of what is going on. And so in order to do that, our training is really multidisciplinary. And so officers are getting more and more training on adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care and understanding human behavior, understanding cycles, like cycles of addiction or cycles of domestic violence, and also understanding what resources are available in the community and what is going to happen with this individual or with this situation after an arrest or after charges are brought. So I think understanding that it's not just a matter of officers are getting a block of instruction mixed in with all sorts of other instruction, but understanding that there really is, we can use that word again, an evolution in training and in sort of the philosophy of how officers are responding to calls.
Just to add on to those comments, I agree with everything that's been said. With regards to the second question about our officers recognizing all forms of abuse and escalation, I think I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. I think that training has evolved. I think it's very different. And I think that though there is definitely room for work, it's gotten a lot better. I specifically have focused just throughout my work in DV with technology abuse. And I can tell you, even just 5 years ago, the response to technology abuse in DV was different than it is today. Just 5 years ago, we were constantly seeing cases where there would be a case of non-consensual pornography or just harassment via social media on dating apps, and it wasn't taken seriously. And I see that's very different today. So I think there is still a lot of work to do, but I think that the knowledge is there. The training is a lot different, and it has gotten a lot better over the years.
Yeah, boy, I'll agree with that again. I mean, when I retired in November, teaching for so many years in my own department and in the academy, I just saw every year, and I really mean this, and cops are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. They're fallible, they're human. But when I left in November, I had never, despite the negative factors and all the unfunded mandates that have been thrown at police to deal with and training obligations and requirements, the level of professionalism that I saw, at least in Bergen County law enforcement, was way better and much improved than each year before that. So I mean, we keep saying that word evolution. That is truly a way to put it. Every year the police do evolve and they get better. They'll never be perfect, but they realize that they have to get better, and they realize that the way they handle things in the past is not the way we do it anymore. And technology abuse is a great example of that. It was something that was kind of thrown on cops as well, something that we haven't seen much of, and now we have to deal with it, and with a whole new set of laws. So it's a huge challenge, but I just can't emphasize enough how much police do with so little.
And I think even in the news, some of what comes up is how much more of social workers police officers have had to become. And part of that is to address these ever-changing situations. Every domestic violence situation that you go into is different from the one before, even when you're going into the same household. So all of that training and ability and evolution has worked its way to make us more aware and more responsive. And we know that abuse can entail so much more. In fact, victims of abuse are more likely to be repeat victims than for any other type of crime. Victims may also not support the police or support getting help from the police, because a lot of times they are scared to have us come into their world, and they're concerned that it may make things worse. Training is the key to understanding. For that reason, the Attorney General's office has committed significant resources to make sure frontline officers are well equipped to help keep families safe. I think we addressed part of this in the last question, but we may be able to have a little bit more on, is there a need for additional trauma-informed training for police responding to domestic violence situations? Do we have to improve understanding of coercive and controlling behavior during that training, or whatever the potential dangers may be when victims have to interact with police? And again, I know it was a lot, so.
You know, Chief, I think one of the things that we didn't talk about in that last question, not just about understanding, you know, having trauma-informed training, which is crucially important, really understanding, as I said, cycles and a little bit of, you know, psychology and human behavior. But it's also, you know, Taylor made the comment about new crimes and new sort of behavior. The family has evolved in society to look different. So, you know, many years ago, when you were trained in domestic violence, you're talking about a man and a woman in a household. And when we talk about domestic violence today, it doesn't look like that. So officers are also having to have an understanding of family dynamics and a new definition really of family, and try to understand how to react appropriately and make a judgment very quickly about what's going on in this household that may not look like what in their minds is a domestic violence situation. And so whether that is you know, 2 men, 2 women, we're talking about individuals who may be transgender. There are other, obviously, family dynamics with you know, children, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think it's important also to just think about how in a place like Bergen County in particular that is so diverse, officers are confronting situations that aren't going to look like a situation out of a textbook, right? And so we're trying to give them tools to really make an assessment of what's going on, you know, very quickly, without them having to, you know, to know everything there possibly could be to know about, you know, sort of everything.
And without judging, right? I mean, that's huge. It's been a learning experience for police officers over the years to not judge the modern world, I guess, the way of putting it. I would just like to add, you know, another one of my major blocks that I would teach to the recruits and to in-house cops that were already cops, was dealing with repeat victims. It is a challenging thing for police officers to do, because most police officers, despite what the media says, are good cops, and they took the job because they want to help people. And it is very frustrating to police officers to go to the same residence and deal with the same victim time and time again after they've spent hours with them explaining their rights and what's available to them and the wonderful services that we have in Bergen County in the area. And I truly mean that. But again, going back to cops are human, and it is very easy to fall into that mindset that I've been to this residence 3 times. I've gotten this woman a restraining order 3 times, and she's still with a guy, and she's still getting beat up. And you know, come on now, you know, what do you want me to do? And you know, one of the things I used to tell cops when I would get these questions is just remember something. Chances are what the victims are telling you is the old iceberg scenario. They're telling you very little of what's really going on beneath the surface. I had one domestic violence victim tell me, listen, Tim, the reason why I let him back into the house so many times and dropped a restraining order so many times is he would get out of jail, he would come home, and he would tell me, listen, if you call the cops again on me or you go with this restraining order, I will not only kill you, but I will kill our children. And then I'll kill myself. Okay? And every night when the restraining order would be dropped, before they went to bed at night, after a beatdown, in plain language, he would say to her, oh, by the way, when I go to work in the morning, if you call the police, like I said, I will kill our children, I will kill you, and I'll kill me. And that's a big, I used to tell cops that story, and they used to like kind of, you could see the light bulbs going off over their heads saying, wow, we never thought of it that way. You know, like, so police officers sometimes do get judgy, and they don't know what it is like to experience domestic violence as them being the victims. So I just think was worth mentioning.
Yeah, I just to add to everything that's been said, I think I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. I think another just scenario that I was thinking of is how and I think the trauma-informed training is so important because it's so important to know how trauma affects individuals, because a police officer may come into a home and the victim is very hostile, is very angry, and them being human, that they could have a reaction to that as, why is this person, you know, acting this way? But when you understand how trauma manifests, and when you've been educated of this is how trauma can come out, this is how the brain is working, this is how, I'm not a psychologist, but you know, this is how the brain is working, this is why this person is acting that way, that can then further help their response. If you know, they know that information, and then that can help them just be another tool in their toolbox to appropriately assess the situation.
And it helps them to be better cops and better detectives, right? So as they understand, you know, what's going on, instead of, Captain Torrell said, judgment, you know, it's not assuming that a person will act or react in a particular way, you know, based upon our own life experience, or saying, well, you know, if you really experienced this, then you would react this way. But understanding that trauma how that manifests and how that can affect people's responses is really important. I also think one other thing I wanted to mention is Captain Torrell talks about you know, responding to the same home multiple times. I was teaching a Narcan coordinator class this afternoon, and we were talking about officers going into homes where they have to revive someone with Narcan once and twice and 3 times and 4 times, and a woman in May 6 times in 30 days. And so compassion fatigue is something that really exists for officers who are trying every day to respond appropriately and bring everything that they have to that call and make sure that, you know, they're doing the right thing. But you know, training and support and the culture of law enforcement by leadership like Captain Torrell or by Chief Jacquie to make sure that those officers have resiliency skills and are prepared to deal with those situations where it may be frustrating, you know, as an officer to go back and back to that, but you need those other skills, those resiliency skills to be able to handle those calls.
And it always is, as the revolving door, not only for the police officers, but the victims as well. And many times the victims start to feel that they deserve this treatment, which makes it even more difficult for them to be able to get out. The Center for Hope and Safety has found that officers know what's needed to prosecute a case without a victim's support. However, as we all know, there are still cases where this doesn't happen. We know that the victims don't want to prosecute, and the officers will drop the charges if we have a victim who isn't cooperating. What else can we do to get police to take these cases and prioritize them and not give up and discontinue this intervention? Is this something that can be trained in the departments or assistance with the domestic violence liaison to help these victims even when they don't know they want help?
Liz, do you want to set the table and talk about victimless prosecutions? And then I'd love to jump in after that.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that we have, whether you're talking about domestic violence or you're talking about these other specialized prosecutions, maybe where you have an elderly victim with dementia or Alzheimer's, or someone who isn't able to advocate for themselves, you know, we're still able to prosecute those cases. You know, it's complicated, but our domestic violence assistant prosecutors, as I said, those prosecutors who handle elder abuse cases, and then there are also cases involving, you know, children or other vulnerable victims who may not be able to speak on their own behalf and maybe even tell their own story. Those cases are still prosecutable, but very, very difficult. And obviously, the navigation of the family, and not just an uncooperative victim in terms of you know, not testifying, but also actively perhaps intervening in the case or attempting to stop it. It's a real challenge. So then you have to work backward from there. How do you do that? You have to build a case. And so that is thorough documentation through the officer and those calls, but it's also advocacy and assistance by staff at the Center for Hope and Safety and other organizations that are going to create the record that is going to allow an assistant prosecutor to pursue that case.
Yeah, if I can add to that, one of the advantages of being on this panel tonight is I am no longer with law enforcement. So I can be a little critical and give you my perspective, and I'm kind of fresh out of law enforcement. And I don't think Liz will disagree with me, or anybody else on the panel will disagree with me, that a good majority of these cases end up in municipal court. They get downgraded from felonies. In New Jersey, we call them indictables, New York felonies. They get downgraded from fourth, third, and sometimes even second degree cases, depending on the strength and weaknesses of the case. They get downgraded and end up in municipal court. And although I'm not talking about any municipal court in particular, I will say this: my experience with municipal prosecutors has not been an enjoyable one at times over the years. And I have tried to talk to municipal prosecutors about doing victimless prosecutions, knowing what limitations there are in doing such a thing without the victim's cooperation, right? And many times these cases, it's not up to the police whether to drop the charges or to proceed with the case. It really is in the hands of the prosecutor. And many times, I will tell you that there have been many animated discussions between myself and prosecutors about dropping cases because I think they were winnable, but prosecutors have a caseload too, and I'm talking about municipal prosecutors. I really am, Liz. I'm not just saying that, but municipal prosecutors have a heavy caseload as well. But I don't find them anecdotally really receptive to the idea of victimless prosecution. So it's a challenge, and it's many times not the fault of the cops. I hope I said that delicately.
Well, I think it's important to understand. I don't know if the audience they have really an appreciation for where these cases go and what that looks like. So, so two things I would add. In the prosecutor's office, we have a victim witness advocacy unit. We have victim witness advocates who work specifically with the domestic violence cases, and so they are real experts in supporting the victims of domestic violence. But they're only part of the prosecution and part of the process if these are indictable or felony charges. So you're correct that the majority of domestic violence cases are handled in municipal court. So that's approximately 70 different municipal courts in Bergen County, and they range in quality. But one thing that they all have in common is that they lack the resources that we have available at a county level in terms of dedicated victim witness advocates or someone who is sort of part of the legal system to assist them. So I think that's an important, an important point to make. The other thing is that there is a crime victims bill of rights. And that crime victims, by law, are given a voice in the resolution or in how cases are pursued. Now, that is not absolute. It's not that they get to dictate what happens. But I think it's also important to understand that. But that by law, crime victims play a role in decisions, have an input in how cases are handled.
I'll just add, just to plug my civil area of the world, and this is not to negate any of the importance that the police or the prosecutor's office do. We all work hand in hand, but the one positive of if a case is, well, I shouldn't say positive, but one alternative, if a case is not prosecuted for whatever reason, if a victim is not cooperating, is that they do have the opportunity to go to civil court to get a restraining order or to go to family court. It's not required to have police intervention in those cases. It's helpful, but it's not required. It's not required to go through the criminal system. It's helpful, but it's not required. And so if you do have a victim who is not cooperating or who does not want to go forward with the criminal system, that is another alternative. And they may just not be cooperating with the legal system in general. But that is one very important aspect of the civil route, is that for someone who may not be comfortable with the criminal system, there is the civil route that they can take, which they may be more comfortable with, and they can get protection that way as well.
So take some miscommunication on whether it's officers dropping or the prosecutors dropping some charges. Take some of the fatigue that officers have of constantly going to the same place in the same place, and then take some of the world today and that lack of trust that police have in many communities that makes it very difficult on people believing the police and how we can play our role in supporting survivors. That lack of trust is weighing very heavily on law enforcement right now. And many police report that morale is at its lowest. What can be done to help build this trust by the officers, maybe by the center staff, by the community at large, in order to help build, repair, and support law enforcement and the victims?
All right, I think that's teed up for me. So now you have my attention. It is, I will say this right now. Police right now in America, and of course, I don't speak for all police, but this is my opinion. I think right now us are under siege because the overwhelming majority of good cops have been blamed for the faults of a few, and they have been faults and they've been doozies. Nobody can, trust me, I was still on the job when George Floyd happened, and I was in the middle of several riots and sticky situations as a result of that. And people were mad, and they had the right to be mad. But what happened, someday maybe somebody will study this at greater detail. But you took an entire class of people in our community, specifically police officers, and you blamed them. Not you. You know what I'm saying? They were blamed for the faults of the few, and that has contributed to mistrust in the community. But it's not all, the police have had some issues, there's no doubt about that, but the overwhelming majority of cops want to do the right thing and want to do the right thing for DV, because I got news for you, most like myself, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, I came up in a household where there was domestic violence, and police officers, if you look at the stats, there are plenty of police officers out there that have come from homes where there was domestic violence. And those officers especially, and maybe that's why I was drawn to this segment of law enforcement so much, those police officers overwhelmingly want to really do the right thing. Part of the problem, there's a saying, right, that the only thing necessary for evil to exist is for good people to remain silent. And I think part of this falls on community leaders and politicians and people that are in charge, that when one cop makes a stupid mistake or even commits an intentional crime, you can't blame the entire police force across the entire country. And I think that contributes to this feeling of mistrust to the police. I really do think that is especially since the George Floyd incident, I saw things that I didn't think I'd ever see. I would go to, in 40 years, I would walk into stores routinely with my badge out and my radio in my hand and my gun showing, and I'd go up to get a cup of coffee and people would just turn and call me pig or start deriding me right out in public. It's a phenomenon that's going on in this country still to a certain extent. And again, not to be repetitive, but yes, police need to work real hard at building trust with community, and yes, have robust police, community policing programs. No doubt about that. But society and the people that are in charge of large groups of us in society need to realize that, judging one group of people by the few is not productive to anybody.
In Bergen County specifically, the fact of my position is an example of the leadership in law enforcement. I work in our community engagement division, and that division was created entirely to focus on the issue of police and community relations and to look at you know, prioritize those relationships. Relationships are two-way, right, and built upon trust and transparency and communication. And we in Bergen County law enforcement are doing, we're really doing our best. We're trying to invest in this relationship. We're trying to be transparent. We're trying to engage and listen and invite community leaders and community partners to the table, having listening sessions, really hearing criticism and feedback, and spending the time on the relationships, building relationships, not just, you know, showing up here or there and you know, sort of being around, but really engaging and building relationships. But we also need that to be done on the other side. We need community leaders and organizations to participate in that dialogue. And so we recognize that there is a lot of work to be done on our end. And we've had listening sessions where we brought in certain groups of people who didn't want to talk, and they were sort of skeptical about why would the prosecutor's office invite us to come in. There must be something, you know, afoot. And it was like, no, we just want to hear from you. We honestly, we're going through the process of sort of self-reflection, and we don't have all of the answers to all of the hard questions. So let's hear from you. And we did that with protest organizers after George Floyd, and we brought them in and said, you're protesting because you have something to say. You have an idea about how to improve the system. We're giving you an audience, and we sincerely want to hear from you. And so I think it's important for you all to know that effort is genuine, whether it is the police leadership at a local level or whether it is at the county level. Genuinely attempting to do our part to invest in this relationship, and certainly a plea for community leaders and other partners to participate in that dialogue with us.
And I think Liz is being a little modest, and I don't mean to say that just because she's on the panel, but I will tell you, since the prosecutor's office community engagement really got in high gear, even before I retired, it really started, and the prosecutor Masella had a large hand in this. He realized the need for it. There were a lot of improvements after that community engagement unit was put in place. And I really do sincerely mean that. It woke a lot of cops up in the rank and file. And it really, when you point a finger at others, right? I forget the expression, that finger ends up coming back at you kind of thing. But really the work that they've done to get those stakeholders in the community together and have a civil conversation and realize that there is improvement to be made on both sides. I even deal with them now in my new role. I deal with the community engagement unit a lot, and they're just amazing people, and kudos to them for doing what they're doing. It's great, and it's a great asset we have in Bergen County. I'm a civil attorney. I'm not in law enforcement. So coming from the other side, I absolutely agree. I think, having conversations like this, having panels like this is so important where there are so many stakeholders. Our relationship with the police at CHS in the legal department is so important. I can't tell you how many times a client calls me and I say, you don't need to call me, you need to call the police, or you need to reach out to someone in law enforcement. I'm not the person. They are vital in helping us to try our cases as well. So I think having conversations like this, having a dialogue, keeping that open, and making sure that you're having these communications with all stakeholders in your community is just incredibly important. Can I just add one quick thing? you all out in the audience don't realize what a huge help you are to law enforcement. Whether it's the Center for Hope and Safety, whether it is ADV, whether it is, unfortunately, the DVCRTs that used to be, I remember when the DVCRT, the Domestic Violence Crisis Response Teams, first started, and this was years ago. And when they were firing on all 8 cylinders, that unit, that helped the police immensely, because many times when the police are dealing with domestic violence victims at 3 in the morning, there's kids, there's, in the police station, there's kids screaming, and we're trying to do restraining orders, which can take for hours and hours. And having the DVCRT team people, or having ADV on the other end of that phone to deal with victims while we're doing what we had to do to just move the case forward, I can't tell you what a resource it was for law enforcement. And when the DVCRT teams kind of what's the term, kind of started to dissipate, and we started to see less and less volunteers, I don't even know, to be honest with you, if they're still operating in meaningful numbers. But anyway, my point is that whether it's CHS, whether it's ADV, whether it's Shelter Our Sisters, whether it's any agency that's out there doing the work that a lot of the people in this audience tonight do, it was a tremendous help to law enforcement. And I hope maybe someday the DVCRT program could get going, but I've had nothing but great experiences with CHS and ADV, especially. Even the Prosecutor's Office Victim Witness Unit is unbelievable what they do to help law enforcement. They're not going to get on the phone with somebody at 3 o'clock in the morning, but ADV will, and DVCRTs will as well. So I would love to see a DVCRT team funded and have a paid DVCRT team out there to be able to respond to PDs at 3 o'clock in the morning and help and support victims, because it's hard getting volunteers now for a number of different reasons. Take away the whole COVID issue, which changed the world for all of us. Anyway.
So with community engagement and building relationships and dialogue and interacting with our stakeholders to try to support law enforcement so that we can better support the victims, we know that partnership building and problem solving are among those core components of a community-oriented policing philosophy. We've talked a lot about the law enforcement side of that partnership and support, but safety is everyone's responsibility, and the Center for Hope and Safety has a partnership role as well. What are some of those important and unique aspects of a partnership between local police and the Center for Hope and Safety? And how would getting a stronger relationship there help law enforcement address domestic violence?
I think I'm probably best to take that one to start off with. That's a huge question, and CHS is such a huge organization. I'm part of the legal department, but there's so many other aspects that I can't even begin. I can try to speak to, but not even begin to speak to, just from our community department and reaching out to other stakeholders in the community to help us as well. I could speak for an hour about their aid with law enforcement. But I know with us, I think what comes to my mind when I think of this question is just the fact that I have my clients talk to me about their interactions with the police, and I'm sure they're probably talking to the police about their interactions with us. I just think communication is such a key, and if we could really strengthen that bond, because I hear this was my experience, both good and bad with this officer. We go to court and there's an order that's put in place of a defendant being allowed back into a home, and the police have to escort, and my clients are telling me how that went, and a lot of that is with attorney-client privilege, but we get the first-hand knowledge of what the clients or what the survivors and victims are going through. And if we can really strengthen our relationship with law enforcement and have that communication and dialogue open, I think that would really open, or I think that can really help just with both programs, aid, they can tell us what they need, we can tell them what we need, because I think so many clients are similar. We're working with the same people a lot of the time, and we're hearing firsthand experiences of what's happening out there in the world. So that would, I think I answered that question. But I think that would kind of be, that is it's such an important relationship. And I just think communication, the more communication you have, the stronger the partnership will be.
Yeah, even through back channels. I mean, I can tell you that being in the position that I was in, every department has that one or two go-to guy or girl that is interested in really doing the right thing for domestic violence victims. Those are the people that you all need to connect with and talk to on, non-specific terms, like you obviously, you want to go to that officer on that job, whether it's the chief or whether it's a patrol officer or whether it's a detective or whoever that cares, and tell them, listen, without getting into specifics, this is what I heard about maybe a few of your offices or one or two of your offices, and here's what we think. Here's a way that we think they could have maybe handled the situation a little better. And talking to someone and have a relationship with in that unofficial way is going to go a lot better than calling anywhere USAPD and saying, hey, can I talk to the internal affairs officer, or can I talk to the sergeant in charge? Make those connections, because I'm telling you, every department has at least one, if not many more, people, cops, human beings that care about domestic violence and take pride in their job, and realize that, cops need to treat DV victims with respect, even the ones that drive us nuts at times, in plain language.
Yeah, I think there are two things. You're absolutely right, Taylor. The communication is the key, and I think, don't assume that the system is perfect. And so if there is an issue in a particular case, don't assume that somebody made a mistake, right? The system isn't perfect, and things are going to happen. And so trying to figure out who needs to be, how to get information from point A to point B to C, and navigating people, that requires people like you, Taylor, and other employees at CHS to navigate this system, and know that it's just a system, right, where information is being passed on. And so you can't assume that a judge knows everything that when you are before that judge, or that the judge is as familiar with the case maybe as you are, for example. The second thing is introduce yourself. As Captain Torrell said, that getting to know who that person is, I think it's important for our community partners to take it upon themselves to come to us. And so, if that is a PD that you're dealing with a lot lately, and you're having some issues, or you're not, and it's just a Tuesday, go to the PD and introduce yourself. There is, police departments are not extremely welcoming places where you just want to walk in, but they need to be, and they're only going to be if the community does their part in walking in and making the introduction.
So with part of that problem being that police don't always get the follow-up, and that we have this imperfect system, that communication really is the key, are there any specific barriers or challenges that we need to overcome, or how to overcome, to help increase that communication?
I think
Well,
that.
Go ahead, Taylor.
Okay, I think that Liz kind of touched on it in what she just said, and don't make assumptions. You know, if you hear something that happened, go talk to someone. You know, don't necessarily, and don't approach it from like a, well, you know, not to get into specifics, but I heard that this happened, because you may not know the whole story. There may, you know, it may be a barrier of the system. Potentially no one made a mistake. So I think so I think, you know, one thing that'd be helpful is like, don't make those assumptions when you're approaching someone, when you're talking to someone. Say, this is what I heard, what can we do about it? Let's have a conversation about it. And let's not assume bad actors right off of the bat, so that you can really sit down and solve the problem, because that's really what everyone wants to do, is just solve the problem of what happened and strengthen our relationship so that we can best help survivors.
Yeah, and I'm going to I'll take a poke at this from a different angle. I see one of the major barriers and challenges I know in the police world, and since my daughter is a social worker, she constantly cries about caseloads, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I know that people in your profession have unbelievable caseloads, and there's only so much you can do with your time and your resources. So I think the challenge probably is the same with police officers. Police departments have to do far more with far less than they ever had before. We're losing cops at an unbelievable rate. Take one particular department recently gave announced a test for police officers, right? And they would normally get 300 to 400 applicants. They got 50 out of what's normally 300 to 400. Nobody's taking the job because of what's gone on in the last few years, and the experienced cops are retiring at record rates. So I think the barriers and challenges are you're dealing with a system where the cops and CHS type workers, social workers, are dealing with caseloads that are just sometimes unmanageable. So I guess that's maybe the $64,000 question for the night, is how do you overcome those barriers and challenges from that perspective of us all having to do too much with too little time and too little resources?
My daughter just wants to say hi to everybody. Can you say hi, Charlotte? I think you're right on the money. Too little with asked to do too much with too little. So I think the question is really about barriers. You've identified barriers, but I think a solution is what we've been talking about all night, which is that this really has to be a partnership. And so that means, again, for us. Okay, just a minute, please. And that means that I'm sorry.
I want some ice cream too, if that's what she's asking for. By the way.
She wants to watch a monster truck. Again, hearing us when we say that there's an invitation to participate in the conversation, and that is feedback. And so if there are problems specifically or generally about how things are being handled, there is a gap in the system, or there is a need that is not being fulfilled, bring that to our attention, to the prosecutor's office, to the local PD. We did a listening session with the leadership at Center for Hope and Safety and some other domestic violence organizations a few months ago, and came up with a list of things, of concerns. And I can tell you that then the leadership in the prosecutor's office went through that list and said, these are things that we can address. these are things that we need to look into further. And these are things that maybe aren't realistic at this time, but they're on our radar to consider and to really look into. And so again, it's that the invitation to be part of the conversation and to initiate the conversation and don't wait for law enforcement to do the first reach out.
So before I just thank the panel, I know we are a little bit over time, but I also know that Gina has been monitoring the Q&A function. And I don't know if there are any questions that you want to discuss briefly before we call it a night.
Jackie, there are only two. One I think has been answered, but I don't want to make any assumptions, okay? One of the questions is probably for Tim, and the question is, you know how we go to doctor's offices and we're kept waiting and all that other kind of stuff because doctors can't get everybody, in quickly. Do police officers have enough time to do the kind of investigation that helps to build that relationship and helps them to really understand the scenario when they intervene?
You better help me out with this, Chief, as well. But the short answer, in my opinion, is in a good number of times, absolutely, they do not. They are, many times, it takes sometimes 2 or 3 hours to get a domestic violence victim from the beginning of the case to the point where you're ready to call it, to the point where you're done with talking to the judge. And then many times you're waiting for a judge to call back, especially if it's off hours. But you're talking about 3 or 4 hours, and the radio is crackling. There's calls coming in. The tour commanders, the bosses on the front desk of police departments are constantly, Officer Jones, are we done yet? I need you on the road. We're shorthanded. I'm getting other towns to come in and help us with calls. The short answer is in most cases, or maybe I shouldn't say most, I should choose my words carefully, but in a lot of cases, an awful lot of cases, they do not have the time to devote. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the DVCRTs and ADV and CHS workers, because they're so invaluable to us when we're trying to juggle 10 things at one time. The whole process of filling the restraining orders out, and while technology is great, it certainly added a lot of time to what we do. What do you think, Chief?
So I'm going to add to that it is kind of the twofold issue of, you're 100% right. So many agencies are short-staffed on a regular basis. So it is a matter of being reactive. It's difficult to be proactive at times and trying to set aside that length of time. But the other part of that issue is we aren't the experts in this field, which is where having somebody from the DVCRT or getting the victim to connect with CHS or ADV to really help us through that process would not only help make the process sometimes a little bit faster or a little bit more palatable, but it would be more thorough and more supportive of the victims.
And the last one, I'm not really sure demands a response necessarily. And I know that we did the Q&A function, so you couldn't identify, but this had to have come from staff. Is it possible for police officers to transport the victim to the police station? Because many victims are worried about being followed if they're then going to go from their house to the shelter. Sometimes if they remain at home but have sort of restraining order, is it unrealistic for them to expect that maybe the police could do an extra patrol if they remain at home?
I don't think it's totally not reasonable to ask for that extra patrol. It happened all the time, and we would routinely have the dispatchers and the tour commanders give extra, what we called extra, at least in Englewood PD, we called them extra attention slips, where police officers would, when they had the opportunity in that sector or that portion of their patrol responsibility, they would give extra attention. As far as driving, yeah, and again, there's limits to that, but as far as driving victims and transporting victims, absolutely. We did it all the time. In fact, one of the policies, and I don't know if you have the same in Ridgewood, Chief, if it's a formal policy or not, but if a victim came in to get a restraining order, and it was during those times of the day where they needed to respond to Hackensack, or they needed to go to Hackensack for something, we would assign a police officer to follow them to the courthouse. And we would tell people, don't go anywhere until we get a police officer free. Sometimes it would take a little while, but generally speaking, we would accommodate fairly quick. But yeah, that's routine for police I don't know of a department that would have a policy where we wouldn't transport victims. We absolutely want to transport victims. And if for some reason, many times victims don't want to get into the police car, because there's kind of a stigma to that. And police cars are not really neat places at times, especially in the backseat areas. We would just have the victim follow us down to the police station. In fact, years ago, I know we're running short on time, just real quick story. We had a detective at the end of getting a restraining order for a victim. She was scared and really scared, and she begged the police to follow her home. And she really didn't have to beg. We would have done it anyway, but we followed her home. And as soon as the detective pulled up in a separate car, he was in an unmarked car, the abuser didn't realize that was a cop, and he jumped out of his car and tried to stab the victim right in front of the police officer. And thank God the detective was there and put an end to it. But that's why we do that, because the most dangerous, any domestic violence expert will tell you, the most dangerous time, I think, for a DV victim is when they get that restraining order. And yeah, so yeah, what do you think? Chief, you want to add to that, or?
No, 100%. I agree with you. And whether it is driving the victim to headquarters, driving the victim to Hackensack, driving the victim to a friend or family member's house, or following them, that really is the norm to try to give the best amount of safety and support when we can. All right, Gina, if that concludes the questions, are there any last comments from any of our panel members?
I'd just like to say that my son thinks that Captain Torrell is Captain Hook. So whether that's the look or because that's your name, but I'd like to give my contact information in the chat, if that's okay. I'll just provide to you my email address, my phone number. Anyone reach out at any time.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you so much for asking me to do this. It is a subject that's close to my heart for a bunch of reasons. Even though I'm retired, it was always one of my main concerns in law enforcement. And I having helped so many domestic violence victims and heard still to this day, I will get a call from a DV victim, or I'll see a DV victim on the street, like in ShopRite in Englewood, and they'll say, Tim, I remember you. I know you're retired, but I remember you, and I remember you helping me. And it's just not me. It's so many cops have done that. So I thank you for asking me to come here. If I can be of any assistance, never hesitate to call me. And I really so thank you all in the audience for doing what you do, because it's a thankless job, like being a cop at times, and you save people's lives. You literally change people's lives, and children that are affected by DV because of the ripple effect of DV. You know, it affects so many people. So thank you.
I'll just say thank you so much for having me. I'm also going to leave my contact information in the chat. I tried to, I think I failed, but I'm going to try again. Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here. And I think these conversations are so important. And so I hope that they can keep going. And yeah, thank you.
So I do think this has really been a very productive, enlightening discussion, and that the contributions made by everyone on the panel, in addition to those in the audience, that although you may have only asked 2 questions, I'm sure there are more questions that you may wake up with tomorrow or the next day or a week later. please don't hesitate. Get those to Gina, get those to Julie, and she can still continue to reach out to us so that we can continue this discussion. I really do want to thank our panelists and our audience for joining us on the Advisory Council tonight in this discussion. We have recorded this webinar, so please feel free to contact Julie directly if you would like to share and/or view this conversation again. Best wishes for a good night for all.